It's time for us to transition away from the simplified planar version of the human face into the final organic version. And we're going to take this step by step, focusing on each key feature of the face individually, beginning with the mouth. So in order to broadly transition from planar to smooth, I'm going to jump to my sculpt workspace and pull out our sculpt brushes. So far I've been sculpting in the layout workspace, which is fine, but the sculpting workspace gets rid of the timeline. And I'm going to use the mesh filter brush to smooth out our entire head. However, I don't want it to touch the lips, the eyes, or the ears. And so I'm going to grab my mask brush with the M hotkey and mask off the eyes. I'm going to extend a little bit beyond their shape because I am going to smooth the mask, but select just beyond each feature, mouth, eyes, and ear. And then with my A pie menu, choose smooth mask and do that maybe 2 or 3 times. There we go. So we've masked out those areas. I'm going to turn off overlays so the mask stays, but we're not seeing the mask, and switch over to the mesh filter. Now we can change the filter type to smooth and then click and drag. And you'll want the click and drag to be pretty broad because it doesn't take effect until you drag a pretty far distance. But now you can see that everything but our masked areas is smoothing into an organic version. So I want to dial that into about here. And if the planes of our face were accurate, then it should still look like a human face, albeit a little bit underdefined. But this way, I can start to refine each of my features without fighting the planar edges. And so at this point, I'll jump over to object mode because I want to add a cube. Shift-A, mesh cube. That's a plane. Shift-A, mesh cube. And I'm going to change the object display properties to display as a wire, also in front. Now, we shouldn't see anything because I turned off overlays, so let's bring those back. And I'm going to scale this down so that it fits the width according to the width of our mouth. I also need object origins, which is in the overlays menu. Sculpt mode turns that off for some reason. All right, and I want the origin or the center of our cube to be right in the center of our lips, the width same as the width of the mouth, and then scale in Z until the bottom edge is at the bottom of our bottom lip. Now from the side, let's move that forward in Y to meet up with our mouth. I'm going to place the origin about in the center of our lips, scale down. And the back edge, I want to be in alignment with the hard edge that we just smoothed out, but we can still see the remnants of it. So if I scale that up a little bit more, I'm going to touch the front of the cube to the front of the lips, and this is about right. So with this properly scaled and positioned, Control A to apply the scale, and now I'm going to cut some edge loops in edit mode. So hit Tab and then Control R. From the side, I'm going to cut 2 edges vertically. Then from the front, I'm going to hit Control R, mouse wheel up to cut 3 vertical edges. Right click to complete the operation, and then Control R, I'm going to cut 1 edge horizontally. Tab back to object mode. Now this cube is going to serve as a grid so that you can visually template the shapes we're going to be talking about. So let's select our head, jump back to sculpt mode, and begin shaping our lips a bit better. Alt-M to clear the mask. Now we're going to be approaching this similar to the way that we would sketch it with pen and paper, where you would outline the lips and then start adding shading to fully realize the drawing. Similarly, we're going to be focusing on the edges of the lips, also called the vermilion borders, and then transition to the more subtle features that affect the shading and finalize the shape. So with my grab brush, we're going to start with the upper lip. First thing I'll do is create Cupid's bow, which is to grab in the center of this grid unit and pull straight up until we touch. And on the outside, we're going to create a smoother curve down, a slight S curve. So we come out a little bit flat, we dip down and then flatten back out. And in the center of Cupid's bow, we're going to bring that up a little bit too and make it a nice round shape. So it's called Cupid's bow if it's not obvious, because if you think of the horizontal line in our grid as the bowstring, the top of the upper lip looks like a bow. It's a pretty good name. And then for the crease of the mouth where the lips converge, I'm going to make sure to keep that flat for now, at least in the middle. But then you can see that we do dip below once we reach the corners of the mouth, also referred to as the commissure of the lips. Because if I make this flat, it starts to look a little bit like an expression, like a slight grin. So in order to keep that neutral, we do want that to dip below the horizontal grid line. And at this point, we've made our upper and lower lips equally thick. And this is valid because there's a wide spectrum of lip shapes. But more often than not, the bottom lip tends to be a little bit thicker. So I will implement that by bringing it below our grid. And so I can keep this really smooth with this nice swooping curve. This tends to look a little bit more feminine, whereas for a male, angularity is a common theme. So if we bring this down into a peak and flatten the bottom, that can look a little more masculine. But you'll hear me say this a lot. Within this structure, there's a wide variety. We're going to talk about that more in a later video. But for now, I'm just trying to stick to middle of the road generic shapes. And so if we take a look at the broader head and the context of our lips therein, I'm pretty happy with the shape so far. However, the peak from the side view, the top of Cupid's bow, I want to pull those forward, and the middle, pull those a little bit back. In fact, if we look from the side view, the upper lip in general is a little bit flat. So let's pull that out. And this also brings us into the philtrum ridge. So if I grab my draw sharp brush, and at this point I am going to switch to my pen and tablet. I was using the mouse to make all those movements. You've probably heard me say that for very precise grab brush movement, I prefer the mouse. But once I get into the other brushes, I like to switch to my pen. And so with the draw sharp, we're just going to create a ridge connecting the peaks of Cupid's bow to the nose. And then once we have the ridges of the philtrum, we're going to hold control and in the middle, push it inward to create a valley. Now on some faces, this is left sharp, but more often than not, it tends to be a smooth dip inward. Now I realize I don't have dynamic topology enabled. Let's enable that. Detail size of 7 should be fine. Refine method of subdivide edges. And actually, while I'm thinking about it, I'm going to change my detail size to 5 temporarily. And I'm going to use the simplify brush to simply remesh this entire mouth area. So if I stroke over my mouth, chin, lips, all of it, you'll see the mesh generate new topology that will accommodate all the shapes we're going to create. So this is another thing I like about dynamic topology versus remesh, where remesh is a global remeshing. Dynamic topology, I can use the simplify brush to just remesh certain parts. And at this point, we're going to be using subdivide edges and commit to the contours we're going to create. So with everything remeshed, I'm going to choose 7 pixels because we're going to be a little closer to the lips. So I'm going to make that a slightly higher size. And at this point, we have established the outline of the lips. So if we were sketching, we would have finished the harsh lines and we're ready to move into the shading, the more subtle structures. One of them being tubercles, which are the plump shapes that appear on the lips. Now, a common one, though it's not on everyone quite as defined, is to align with Cupid's bow shape. And in the center, where the lips collide with each other, with my grab brush, I can move this down. All right, and that's going to start to create a tubercle in the middle. Now with a draw sharp brush, hold control and start to outline around that shape. And we can also use the crease brush because that will actually generate new topology. And this starts to create a plump shape in the middle, inflate on top of that to finalize the shape. Also plump the outside of that central tubercle. Again, focusing on the upper lip. And we can inflate and then smooth out. Okay, you'll start to see our geometry get a lot smoother, which is what we want as we refine these shapes into their final form. Now, I want to further push in the collision between the lips. All right, so the central crease. I'm going to use my draw sharp brush, hold control with a fairly large brush size, and hold Control to push that in. All right, you'll see the shading increase its contrast, meaning that it's getting deeper. Let's go a little bit further. It's okay to go too far. In fact, I would encourage that because we're not going to use simply the crease brush to represent the collision of upper lip to lower lip. We're actually going to use the inflate brush at this point because this will inflate the two surfaces to intersect with each other. And that intersection becomes the crisp line between the lips. I find this to be much more believable when it comes to sculpting our lip shape. And so since we are going to inflate, it's a good idea to push the lips a little bit too far whenever you use the crease brush initially. All right, so this upper tubercle is perhaps a little bit too defined, but that brings up another point that I recommend when it comes to sculpting an approach, and that's to make the features too strong because you can always dial it back, very easily dial it back. Whereas if you're too subtle, it's a little more difficult to make those features more pronounced. So you'll see me do that a lot. Take the feature too far and then dial it back. All right, let's smooth the bottom lip. Also, the edges of the lip, the vermilion borders are a little too low res. So let's use our inflate brush. And this works fine because often I use the inflate brush to emphasize those edges because it is a distinct ridge. And we'll smooth them out. And on some people, it's a very, very crisp line. So I will push out for the initial shape, and even on the outside and inside of that initial shape, hold Control to push down. And these are subtle strokes, but that will just slightly emphasize the vermilion border a bit better. Same thing on the bottom. Push out first, and then hold Control on the inside. There we go. That also helps to begin plumping those tubercles on the lips. Sometimes I'll do the outside too, but definitely keep things smooth. Now, I think my smooth brush at the default, let's see, yeah, 0.6, 0.7. I'm going to bring it down to more like a 0.5 so that I don't overly smooth things. There we go. It's looking pretty good. Let's work on some tubercles on the bottom. Just plump up their mass a little bit with the inflate brush. Smooth. And then grab the draw sharp. And we're going to cut a line, a valley in the middle, and then curve out as we reach the vermilion border. All right. So I've cut them in too strong. And then just hold Shift to smooth. Maybe plump up these tubercles a little bit more. That's looking pretty believable at this point. And the pronounced ridge of the vermilion border, especially on the bottom, can be a little bit less on the front, but especially less as it approaches the corner of the mouth. So we're going to smooth that out a lot. You really don't see this edge approach the corner very defined. All right, so we're going to smooth that out. A nice taper. And we will turn our attention to the corner of the mouth. And with the draw sharp brush, I'm going to push this inside a lot. All right, this is a very good example of pushing this too far. And I'm emphasizing this especially because it's so often that new sculptors working on the face miss this feature entirely or don't push it far enough. So by pushing this inside, give it a lot of depth. If we look from the side, you can get an idea of the depth. If I switch to wireframe, you can see that we push that in quite a lot because like we did with the collision of upper and lower lip, we're going to use our inflate brush to tighten the surfaces around the commissure. All right, so that's looking pretty good. The next step is going to be using the clay strips to build out a column-like mass around the outside of the commissure. So if we take a look at our anatomical model, what we are going to be generating is a shape that combines the superior jowl muscle as well as the depressor anguli oris muscle. So these two shapes are super important for a believable mouth. And it's one that I see often overlooked or not defined enough. So I'm going to define it too much with the clay strips brush. All right, once we've built that out, immediately smooth it. And smooth a little bit less as we get to the corner of the mouth, because I want to maintain this valley. All right, it looks great on the top, maybe smooth it out a little bit more, but it's not quite as defined on the bottom, so I want that to be more defined. Let's use our Draw Sharp brush. And again, this is remembering that shape from the anatomy. I'm going to cut a valley along the edge of that depressor anguli oris muscle. All right, I'm going to cut it in too much and then smooth out. All right, this is where it becomes very beneficial to understand facial anatomy, because you can cut ridges and valleys that align with the musculature, and smoothing those out starts to look more like skin is over top of those features. All right, from the side, I like to bring the lower part of this column a little bit back so it's at an angle. And that's starting to look pretty good. Another way to measure if this is too much, if you've put too much volume in the column, is from this side. And you can tell that this is kind of poking out a little bit too much. So let's bring it back, reduce its volume slightly. There we go. That's looking much more natural. Now, as we start to move down into the chin, let's take a look at our anatomical model. There is a valley that's formed in between the lower lip, or the orbicularis oris muscle, and the mental fat. So from the corner of the mouth, it kind of swoops down and then connects in between. We're going to create a valley that emphasizes that. So with the Draw Sharp brush, hold Control, and we're going to cut that shape. There we go. And typically, this is a very pronounced feature underneath the lips that creates that shadow. Whenever you see people draw lips, this is always something that they include. But they don't usually include this entire shape. But we're going to smooth this out and leave the creases more pronounced as we approach the corner of the mouth, also as we reach the space in between the chin and the lip. All right, so make sure you keep everything smooth. In this case, we have a bit of a ridge that we don't desire, and that's an artifact from too much geometry. You can see that it's a border between higher geometry resolution and lower geometry resolution. So if we get to this spot, I'm going to switch to Subdivide Collapse and very carefully either use the Simplify brush and then Smooth. All right, so that unifies the density of mesh topology and allows me to smooth. Also, if I undo that, honestly, what I do more often is use the inflate brush, slightly push it out as it regenerates geometry, and then smooth it back. Either way, simplify brush or the inflate brush method works fine. And at this point, we've got a pretty believable mouth. The last thing that I like to do for the lips is, again, more often than not, in my experience, I find that the upper lip, as it approaches the corner of the mouth, dips down again. It's not as straight. It can be straight, but more often it's not. So I'm going to mask off this area, smooth out this, whatever's happening right here. Oh wait, I can't smooth when I have my mask brush enabled, so let's go to Grab, smooth this out. Just kind of fix this shape a bit. Push it back with the Draw Sharp. Inflate. Oh, I'm on Subdivide Collapse. I want that on Subdivide Edges. And I'm going to mask out this corner of the upper lip. Let's turn on our overlays once again. You can also hide the cube by itself in the outliner. Mask out the upper lip, just the outside corner of the upper lip. And what can be tricky about this is the fact that we don't want any of the bottom lip. So we have to come in really close, hold Control, and mask that stuff out. All right, that should be... we should be able to make that work. Control-I to invert, and I'm going to disable overlays. Now I want to use my Grab brush to pull this shape down. We want to keep it smooth. It started out really bumpy just then. Pull it back a little bit. And that looks pretty good. The mask didn't work out quite as well as I wanted. Let's clear the mask and then try and work with both shapes together. It can be difficult to do this because, if I want to inflate the upper lip but not the lower lip, naturally the lower lip will get a little inflation as well. So you kind of have to fight both sides. And I really kind of messed this up. I want it to be a nice, smooth transition. Let's use the inflate to plump that back up as we approach the corner of the mouth. Broadly smooth this surface. Yeah, that's looking more natural. You pull this down a little bit more. There we go. And if we look from the front, let's turn our grid back on. And then if I turn on annotations again, and I believe sculpt mode has them turned off. There we go. And so if we summarize the shape of the lips, we start with the corner of the mouth, then we come down, back up, and then down again. The upper lip similarly comes down and then back up to form Cupid's bow. And the bottom lip dips down sooner and flattens out. And that's how we sculpt the lips. Now there's just a couple other things I want to do, like the chin, for example. A lot of chins, I would say most chins are smooth and kind of knobby like this, but there's also the cleft of the chin, which is formed by, if I hide our fat pads, the mentalis muscles. So these two right here, you have the fat pad, mental fat over top of it, but the gap in between the mentalis muscles, if that's significant enough, it can form a cleft and the fat kind of suctions to that shape. And so we can form that with the draw sharp brush. I'm going to make it a big fall off, or rather a large brush size, hold control, and kind of concentrate strokes in the center and taper off from top to bottom. And then we can smooth out around it, maybe inflate to bring the bulbous shape back out. It's probably a little bit too deep for a cleft. So inflate it back out, and that looks pretty good. And then the very last thing we'll do, I'm going to deepen the transition from cheek to nose, just to cut this in. We're going to do that anyway once we get to the nose, but that leads into cutting our laugh line, or the nasolabial fold. This comes from the nasolabial fat. If we turn off X-ray, the edge of this fat is what determines the laugh line, which starts at the top of the nostril. We'll use our draw sharp brush. I'm going to cut down and encircle the corner of our mouth. Now I'm going to start extreme, and we will smooth it out towards the bottom, but deepen the initial connection to the nose. This is probably a better use case for the crease brush so that it pinches the seam together as well. Okay, zoom out. Some people have more pronounced laugh lines, some extend further than others. So I'm going to smooth this out so it doesn't extend quite so far. But it's important to have this subtle kind of ridge. You see that a lot in people's faces. Maybe from people who laugh a lot. But that looks pretty good as a transition into the cheek. However, I don't want it to puff out underneath the laugh line. So we're going to grab the clay strips, hold control, and simply chunk out some of that mass, some of that volume. All right, hold control, volume removed, and then smooth. There we go, that looks pretty good. The laugh line is a little too distinct. Let's try inflating it. Bring those surfaces together, similar to how we did with the lips. Smooth it out. There we go. I think that looks believable. And though it does look a little weird having one refined part of the face while the rest is unrefined, we can use our H hotkey to box out things that we don't want to see. There we go. And just focus on the mouth. And again, I'm aiming for a generic structure. While everybody has the same foundational structure in their face, the lips, the chin, the laugh line, all these things can be altered to drastically change the appearance of a person, but all of those features need to be there to some degree. And so with the mouth done, in the next video, we'll move on to the nose.